The wig maker on Bishop Lane weighed the rope of dark hair in his palm as if it were already someone else's, and named a price low enough to feel like an apology. Margaret Wexford did not flinch. She had learned in the 11 months since her father's burial that flinching only invited a lower number. The shop smelled of tallow and the dust of other women's lives, and outside the small gray window, the third snow of the season had begun to settle on Greywick Village, soft and indifferent, while she stood with her bonnet in her hands and let a stranger appraise the one thing the world had not yet taken from her. He set down his scales. He counted out the coins, copper, and a little silver into a chip saucer that had held other women's surrenders before hers, and slid the saucer across the counter without quite meeting her eye. There was a length of mirror behind him, foxed at the edges, and Margaret made herself not look into it. She unpinned the heavy coil at the back of her neck with steady fingers and let it fall, and the wig-maker gathered it into his fist and lifted the scissors and asked, not unkindly, whether she was certain. She said that she was, and when the cold steel closed against the back of her neck, with a sound like a small dry branch breaking, she kept her eyes on the window and the falling snow, and thought only of 3 children 2 miles away who had not eaten since the morning before, and of the loaf she would carry home in her apron, and of how a thing of no use to anyone but herself could be turned, in one cold quarter of an hour, into a week of full bowls. She did not weep. There would be time for that later, and there would not be much of it, because the bread had to be bought before the baker shut his shutters, and the milk before the cart left the green, and the candle stubs before the dark came down on a cottage where 3 small people were waiting for a woman they had no reason to love and every reason to need. If you have ever given a thing you could not afford to lose to people who would never know the cost, then you already understand Margaret better than the whole of Greywick did that winter. Stay with her. The world is about to learn her worth a very long way after she had stopped expecting it to. Margaret Wexford was 24 years old, and the village had decided, with a quiet finality it reserved for women without fortune, that she was the parson's spinster daughter and would remain so. Her father had been the curate of St. Aldhelm's for 19 years, a gentle man with more learning than living, and when the fever took him in the spring, he had left her a shelf of books, a kindness owed by half the parish, and not 1 shilling that could be spent. The new curate had needed the cottage. Margaret had needed somewhere to go. And so she had taken the only position a gentlewoman of no means, and no connection could take without disgrace, which was to take a position no gentlewoman was supposed to want at all. She had gone into service at Wexbridge Hall. The irony of the name was not lost on her, though no one at the hall knew or would have cared that a Wexford had come to scrub the nursery floors of a house whose lands had once, 3 generations back, marched alongside her grandfather's modest acres before debt swallowed the Wexford holding whole. She did not speak of it. She had learned that the past was a coat too fine for her present, and she had folded it away. At the hall, she was not Miss Wexford. She was the nursery maid, and the housekeeper called her Margaret when she was pleased, and girl when she was not, and the footman did not call her anything at all. The children were the reason she stayed when wiser women would have gone. There were 3 of them, and they belonged to the master of the house, and they had no mother. The eldest was a boy of 7 named Henry, grave beyond his years, who had stopped speaking for a season after the funeral and had only lately begun again. The middle child was Beatrice, 5 years old and full of furious questions, who attached herself to Margaret's skirts within a week and would not be detached. And the youngest was Thomas, not yet 3, who had been a fortnight old when his mother died and who knew no warmth that had not come from a servant's hands. Their father, the Earl of Greywick, was a name the household lowered its voice to speak. He was at the hall and not in it. He took his meals alone. He rode out before light and returned after dark. He had not in the 8 months Margaret had served his children, entered the nursery once. To the household he was the cold earl who had buried a wife and shut a door. To Margaret he was a sound on the stair she had learned not to listen for. His name was Julian Hartwell, the 7th Earl of Greywick, and he was 34 years old. And he had not meant to become a man his own children flinched from. Grief, though, is a country with its own borders, and he had crossed into it the night his wife died, bearing his third child, and he had not found the road back. He believed, with the particular certainty of a man who has stopped examining his beliefs, that the children were better tended by hands steadier than his own. He paid the wages. He approved the accounts. He did not climb the stairs. What he did not know, because he had arranged his life precisely so as not to know it, was that the steward had been quietly economizing on the nursery for months, that the allowance for the children's keep had been trimmed and trimmed again to feed an estate bleeding from his neglect, without a word to anyone, to make up the difference out of wages that did not stretch to cover it. Margaret had noticed first in October, when the nursery coal ration was halved and no one would say why. She had said nothing. She had carried up wood from the kitchen scuttle when she could take it unseen. In November, the children's supper had shrunk from 3 dishes to 2, and then from 2 to a thin gruel that left Beatrice crying with a hunger she was too young to name and too proud to explain. Margaret had begun to bring bread in her apron pocket, bought from her own coin in the village. On her half-day by December, her own coin was gone, and so she had walked into the wigmaker's shop on Bishop Lane and sold the dark hair that fell past her waist, the hair her father had once called the only inheritance her mother left her. And she had bought bread and milk and a small twist of sugar for the children of a man who did not know she existed. This is the part the village would tell wrong for years afterward, if it told it at all. They would say a maid sold her hair for a handful of coins, and they would shake their heads at the foolishness of it, and they would never once ask what the coins had bought. What they bought was a week of Beatrice sleeping without waking to cry, a week of Thomas's cheeks losing the gray pinch that had frightened Margaret more than she let herself think, a week of Henry who noticed everything and said almost nothing, watching her with an expression she could not read as she ladled out a supper that for once filled the bowls. He was 7. He understood more than a child of 7 should have to. On the 3rd night he said in his careful small voice that her hair had been long that morning and was short now, and Margaret had told him she had grown tired of dressing it, and he had looked at her for a long moment and said nothing more, and she understood that he had not believed her and had chosen, out of a courtesy far older than his years, to let her keep her lie. The cold came harder after Christmas. The estate, Margaret gathered from the kitchen talk, was in a worse way than anyone above stairs admitted. There were creditors. There was a London man of business who wrote letters the Earl did not answer. There was talk, lowered and quick, of the hall itself being let or sold, and beneath all of it ran a colder current still, which was that the Earl's elder sister, the Dowager Viscountess Ardley, had come to stay, and had brought with her a great many opinions about how a motherless house ought to be run. Lady Ardley was 51 years old and had buried 2 husbands and a great deal of softness. She had arrived in a traveling carriage with 3 trunks and a companion, and she had taken one look at the nursery and pronounced it a disgrace, by which she meant not that the children were thin, which she did not appear to notice, but that the nursery maid was insufficiently deferential and the linens insufficiently fine. She had a way of looking at Margaret that traveled from hem to crown and found the whole of her wanting. On her 2nd day she had remarked to the housekeeper in a voice pitched to Carrie that it was a wonder the children had not been ruined entirely, left as they were to the care of a charity case, with cropped hair like a fever patient, or a girl who had sold it for gin. A girl who had sold it for gin. Margaret, on her knees at the nursery hearth, with Thomas asleep against her shoulder, heard the words travel down the corridor and did not move. She had heard worse. She had learned that the worst thing one could do with such a remark was to let it show that it had landed. Henry, however, sitting on the window seat with a book he was not reading, had heard it too, and she watched his small jaw set in a way that was so exactly his father's that her chest ached with it, and she said his name softly until he looked at her, and she shook her head. Once, meaning let it go, meaning it does not matter, meaning the lie she told the village, and the lie she told the household, and the lie she was beginning to tell herself. It mattered. It would matter a great deal. Not yet. The Earl learned his children were hungry on the 9th of January, and he learned it by accident, which was the only way a man so carefully sealed could have learned anything at all. He had come in late from riding the eastern boundary, where a tenant's roof had fallen in under the snow, and he had taken a wrong turn in his own house. The hall was old and rambling, and he had spent so little of himself inside it that the upper corridors had grown strange to him. He had meant to reach his study by the back stair, and had come instead to a landing he did not know. And there had been a light under a door, and a sound, and he had stopped. The sound was a child crying. Not the loud, theatrical crying of a child denied a sweet, but the low, exhausted weeping of a very small person who has cried for a long time and expects no answer. And then a woman's voice, low and steady, not soothing the way nurses soothed, but speaking plainly, the way one speaks to a person whose grief one respects. The voice was saying that there would be more in the morning. The voice was saying that she had a little put by and that he should not be afraid. The voice was saying, and here it dropped so low he had to hold his breath to catch it, that no one was going to let him be hungry. Not while she had a thing left to sell. Julian Hartwell stood in the cold corridor of his own house and did not understand what he had heard. And then, slowly, like a man reading a letter in a language he had once known, he did. He did not open the door. He would think about that later, the not opening, and be ashamed of it, and grateful for it in equal measure, because a man who opened that door in that moment would have made it about himself, and the woman behind it had spent months making sure it was never about herself at all. He went down the strange stair and along the corridor he did know, and he sat in his study with the fire unlit and the letters unanswered. And for the first time since the night his wife died, he thought about something other than the size of his own loss. The next morning he sent for the steward. What passed between them Margaret never fully knew. But the coal came back to the nursery that afternoon, a full scuttle and then another, and the supper that came up from the kitchen had meat in it, and the housekeeper's face, when she brought the new orders, was the face of a woman who has been told something that frightened her. Margaret received it all without expression. She had learned not to trust a single good day. She fed the children and banked the fire, and told herself nothing had changed because she had survived the autumn by expecting nothing, and she did not know how to stop. Something had changed, though, and the first sign of it was that the Earl began to climb the stairs. He did it badly at first. He did not know how to be in a room with his own children. He stood in the nursery doorway like a man at the edge of cold water, and Beatrice stared at him with her furious, questioning eyes, and Thomas hid in Margaret's skirts, and only Henry, grave Henry, rose and bowed to his father, with a formality that broke something in the room. Margaret watched the Earl's face, and saw it do a thing she had not expected. She saw it crack, just for an instant around the eyes, before the discipline came down again like a portcullis. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had been wrong about him. He was not cold. He was a man who had decided that feeling anything would unmake him, and had been right, and had chosen unmaking over feeling, and had only now begun to suspect the cost. He came every day after that. He did not announce it, and he did not explain it. He would stand, and then he would sit, and then one afternoon he was on the floor with Thomas building a tower of wooden blocks, his fine coat dusty at the knee. The tower rose 4 blocks and 5, and then leaned. And Thomas, who had never in his short life seen this large grave man do anything but pass like weather, set the 6th block on with the fierce concentration of the very young, and the whole of it came down across the Earl's knee. There was a silence in which Margaret held her breath. And then Thomas laughed. The loud, astonished laugh of a child who has discovered that falling things are wonderful. And the Earl's face did something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. And he gathered the blocks and began again without a word, and built it so that it would fall a second time, on purpose, because the falling was the part the boy loved. Margaret kept to the edges of these visits. It was not her place to be seen, and she had spent a lifetime learning where the edges were. The Earl, though, who had never learned her name and had no reason to ask it, began to address remarks to the air near where she stood. Observations about the children, questions he did not seem to expect, answered, and she answered them anyway, plainly. Because the children's welfare required it, and because she had never in her life been able to leave a true thing unsaid when a child's good depended on it. He said one gray afternoon that the boy seemed to have grown. He said it as a man says a thing he is afraid to ask directly. And Margaret, folding linen, said that Henry had been very thin in the autumn and was better now, and the Earl had gone still in a way she was learning to recognize, and asked, in a level voice that cost him something, how thin. And she had told him. Not all of it. Enough, though. She had told him about the gruel and the halved coal and the autumn, and she had not told him about Bishop Lane because that was hers and she would not spend it. But she had told him enough that he understood his children had been hungry in his own house while he sat below stairs grieving a woman who would have been ashamed of him for it. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was very low. He said that he had not known. And Margaret, who could have let him keep that comfort, did not, because she had buried a father who taught her that mercy and honesty were the same virtue wearing different coats. She said that a man could not know what he had arranged not to see, and then she had braced herself for dismissal because servants did not say such things to earls, and waited. He looked at her then. Truly looked, for what she realized was the first time, and he said, after a silence that seemed to take the whole gray afternoon into itself, that she was quite right, and that he was obliged to her, and that he did not know her name. She told him, Margaret. He repeated it once, quietly, as if filing it somewhere he meant to keep, and then Beatrice demanded his attention, and the moment closed, and Margaret went back to the linen with her heart doing something foolish and unwelcome that she resolved firmly to ignore. She was good at ignoring things. She had a great deal of practice. The body keeps its own counsel, though, and over the weeks that followed, Margaret found that hers had begun to betray her in small ways she could not govern. She knew the instant he entered a room without turning to look. Her hands, steady through every hardship of the autumn, were not steady when he stood near. There was a warmth that climbed her throat when his voice dropped to the low register he used. Only in the nursery a register she came to understand he used nowhere else in the house, and she despised herself for noticing, and noticed anyway. She was a servant. He was an earl, in mourning. The distance between them was not a distance, it was a wall, with a law on the top of it. And she knew the law, and she respected the law, and her foolish traitor heart paid the law no mind at all. If you have ever cared for someone you had no right to care for, and gone on caring, quietly, expecting nothing, taking only the small daily portion of being near them, then you know the particular ache of those weeks better than Margaret could have said it aloud. She did not say it aloud. She fed the children and mended the linen and let herself have only what the day gave her, which was his voice in the low register and the dust on his knee, and the slow miracle of 3 children learning, after a winter of fear, that they were safe. The Dowager Viscountess Ardley watched all of it, and did not like what she saw. Lady Ardley had come to Greywick with a purpose, and the purpose was a marriage. Her brother was a widower, with a title and an estate that, whatever its present difficulties, was ancient and rebuildable, and she had a candidate in mind, a Miss Cordelia Vane, the daughter of a banking family, with new money and an old hunger for a coronet. The match would settle the estate's debts. It would put a competent and well-dowered woman at the head of the nursery. It would, Lady Ardley believed, restore the order that her brother's grief had let slip, and she was a woman who believed in order the way other people believed in God. She had written to the Vanes, she had arranged a visit, and she had begun to notice that her brother, who for 3 years had been as responsive to feminine company as a closed door, climbed the nursery stairs every afternoon, and came down with the dust of the floor on his knees, and a softness in his face that had no business being there. She investigated, as such women do, through the servants. And what she learned in pieces, over a fortnight, was that the nursery maid was a clergyman's daughter fallen on hard times, that she had no fortune and no family and no prospects, that she had cropped hair the household whispered about, and that the Earl had been seen to speak to her, not as a master speaks to a servant, but as a man speaks to a woman whose answer he wants. Lady Ardley did not panic. Panic was for lesser women. She moved up the veins, though visit by 3 weeks. And she began, with the patient cruelty of the truly certain, to make the nursery maid's position untenable. She voiced the dismissive label a second time, and this time she voiced it where it would do the most work, which was to the assembled household at the servants' assembly the housekeeper held each quarter. She had no business at such a gathering and attended it precisely so that her words would carry. She spoke of standards. She spoke of the dangers of elevating those who did not know their place. And she said, in a voice of velvet contempt, that a girl who would sell her own hair in a public shop like a desperate creature could hardly be trusted with the moral education of an earl's children, and that for her own part, she wondered what else such a girl might be willing to sell. The housekeeper went white. A kitchen maid gasped. And Margaret, standing at the back with her cropped head high, understood that the comfortable invisibility she had spent a year building had just been taken from her deliberately by a woman who had calculated exactly what it would cost. She did not defend herself. There was no defense that would not make it worse. She had learned that a woman accused of selling herself could not unsay it by protesting her virtue, because the protest was treated as the proof. So she stood, and she let the words land, and she thought of the bread they had bought, and she did not regret a single coin. Henry, though, had followed her to the assembly, the way he followed her everywhere now, and Henry had heard, and Henry, 7 years old, and grave as a judge, had gone to find his father. Margaret did not know this until later. What she knew at the time was that Cordelia Vane arrived at Wexbridge Hall on a Thursday in a carriage with the Vane crest freshly painted on the door, and that she was beautiful in the polished, expensive way of a woman who has never wanted for anything, and that Lady Ardley installed her in the best guest chamber and orchestrated her presence at every meal and walk and evening as though the marriage were already a settled thing. Miss Vane was not unkind. That was the worst of it. She was simply a person who had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice and believed it, and moved through the house with the serene confidence of the entitled, pausing at the nursery door one afternoon to observe the children with the mild interest of a woman inspecting a property she expected to inherit. She looked at Margaret the way one looks at furniture, and Margaret, who had been looked at that way her entire life, was surprised to find that this time it stung. The dark moment came at the dinner Lady Ardley had built the whole campaign toward, a dinner for 30, in the great dining room of Wexbridge Hall, candles down the length of the long table, the Vanes at the place of honor, the neighborhood gentry assembled to witness what everyone understood was to be the announcement of an engagement. Margaret had no place at such a dinner, and would not have been within 100 feet of it, except that Lady Ardley, with a cruelty so precise it could only have been planned, had arranged for the children to be brought down to be presented to the assembled company, dressed in their best A, and had given the order that the nursery maid bring them and wait in the corridor to take them up again. It was a small humiliation, dressed as a kindness. Margaret saw it for what it was. She dressed the children carefully, and she brushed Henry's hair, and tied Beatrice's sash, and held Thomas on her hip, and she brought them to the dining-room door, and she stood in the corridor in her plain gray gown, while inside the candlelight fell on silk and diamonds and a beautiful woman, who was to be the children's new mother. She could hear it all. She heard Lady Ardley present the children. She heard the murmur of the company. She heard Miss Vane say something gracious and cool to Henry, and she heard Henry not answer, and she heard Lady Ardley's voice take on a brittle edge as she covered the silence. Aye. And then she heard Lady Ardley, for the 3rd time, and the last voice, the label she had been sharpening all winter, except that now she did it for an audience of 30, turning a private cruelty into a public verdict. She said lightly, as though it were an amusing anecdote, that the children were a little wild yet, having been left to the care of a servant of no breeding, a girl who had, if the company could credit it, sold her own hair in the village like a common unfortunate, and who was hardly the influence one wished for the future Lady Greywick's stepchildren. The dining room laughed. Not all of it. Enough, though. And in the corridor, Margaret closed her eyes and held the Earl's youngest child against her shoulder, and felt the whole long winter settle onto her at once. The cold and the hunger, and the scissors and the lie she had told a grave little boy about her hair, and she understood that she had given everything she had to people who would never know it, and that the world had decided what she was, and that there was no door, anywhere, that would open for a girl who had sold her hair for gin. What she did not know, because she could not see into the room, was that Henry had let go of his sister's hand and walked the length of the long table to where his father sat, and had climbed up onto the chair beside him in front of all 30 guests, and had said, in his careful, small voice that none the less carried in the silence the way only a child's voice can, that the lady was wrong, that Margaret had not sold her hair for gin, that Margaret had sold her hair to buy them bread, because they had been hungry, and no one had come, and she had fed them when no one came. The dining room went very still. Julian Hardwell set down his glass. The whole winter arranged itself in his mind in a single terrible instant. The light under the door, the low voice promising more in the morning, the cropped hair he had noticed and not asked about, the boy's grown frame, the autumn she had told him of and the autumn she had not. He understood all at once what the woman in the corridor had done, and what it had cost her, and what he had let his own house do to her in return for it. And he rose from his chair at the head of his own table, in front of the assembled gentry, and his sister and the woman he was meant to marry, and he walked the length of the long room to the door where a servant stood in a plain gray gown with his child asleep on her shoulder. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. He stood before her in the candlelight with 30 people watching, and his sister's face going slowly white at the end of the table, and he said the thing that ended it, the thing that could not be unsaid, the thing that was specific and irrevocable, and cost him every careful wall he had spent 3 years building. He said, "This is the woman who fed my children. She will be my wife." The silence after was the longest of Margaret's life. She stood with Thomas warm and sleeping against her and could not make the words mean anything. She saw Lady Ardley's hand go to the table's edge. She saw Miss Vane's polished composure flicker just once into something almost like relief, because a woman told all her life that she is the correct choice, does not always wish to be chosen by a man whose heart is plainly elsewhere. She saw the faces of 30 strangers turn from amusement to astonishment to the slow dawning recognition of a thing they had witnessed and would tell about for the rest of their lives. And she saw the Earl Julian looking at her not as a master looks at a servant, but as a man looks at the single fixed point in a world that has been spinning, waiting for her answer. She did not give it there. She had that much pride left, and he, to his credit, did not press her for it in front of an audience. He simply offered her his arm, in the corridor, away from the table, and she took it because her knees had stopped being reliable, and he walked her and the sleeping child away from the candlelight and the staring faces, and into the quiet of the nursery stair. And there at last, in the place where the whole winter had happened, he asked her properly. He told her he had heard her through the door in January. He told her he had not opened it, and had been ashamed and grateful both. He told her that he had been a man who decided not to feel, and that she had walked into his house and fed his children and asked nothing, and that somewhere in the watching of it, he had begun, against his own will and his own grief, to be a man again. He told her that he did not know her name in January, and that he knew it now, and meant to know nothing better for the rest of his life. He told her of the steward and the trimmed accounts and his own long blindness, and he did not ask her to forgive it, which she marked, because a lesser man would have asked and made the forgiving her labor instead of his own. He told her that the boy had come the length of the table and climbed the chair beside him and said the true thing in front of 30 people who had laughed, and that a child of 7 had shown more courage in one sentence than his father had shown in 3 years. And then, because he was still who he was, a man who issued commands that were love-wearing armor, he said low, the words unsteady for the first time since she had known him, "Stay. Stay. And let me spend the rest of my life learning what your hair was worth." Margaret Wexford had not wept in the wigmaker's shop, and she had not wept at the servants' assembly, and she had not wept in the corridor while 30 strangers laughed. She wept now, quietly, the way she did everything, with Thomas asleep between them, and Julian's hand at last in her cropped hair as though it were the most precious thing in the house, which to him it had become. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She made him wait, though, for just long enough to be sure he understood it was a choice and not a rescue. That she was not a hungry girl saying yes to bread. That she was a woman who had given everything and was being, at the very last, and against all the world's arithmetic, given something back. Lady Ardley left Wexbridge Hall within the week. She was not destroyed, because Margaret would not have it, and asked Julian to let his sister go with her dignity. And he, learning already to bend his certainties to hers, agreed. The Vanes departed the morning after the dinner, Miss Cordelia Vane pausing at the carriage to say to Margaret a single quiet sentence that surprised them both, which was that she hoped Margaret knew her own good fortune, and that she had never wished to marry a man who climbed the stairs for someone else. The estate's debts were not solved by the dinner, but they were not Margaret's to solve. And over the spring, with a wife who understood economy as only the genuinely poor can understand it, Julian set his accounts in an order he had not managed in 3 years of grieving neglect. They were married in the small church of St. Aldhelms, where Margaret's father had preached for 19 years, on a morning in early March when the snow had at last begun to go, and the first hard green of the year was showing in the churchyard. There were no 30 guests. There were the 3 children, scrubbed and solemn and barely contained, and the housekeeper weeping into her good handkerchief, and a scattering of villagers who had known the curate and had come, some of them, to be quietly ashamed of the things they had said about his daughter. Margaret wore a gown the color of cream that Julian had ordered against her protests, and her hair, which had begun to grow back, was dressed close to her head in a style that the more fashionable ladies of the county would shortly and absurdly begin to imitate, never knowing that they were copying the head of a woman who had sold her hair to feed 3 hungry children in the dark of the worst winter of her life. The coda of this story is a quiet one, as the best of them are. By Christmas of that year, the nursery at Wexbridge Hall was the warmest room in the house, and it was warm because the Earl himself had given the order that it always be so, and checked it, climbing the stairs each evening not out of duty now, but out of a hunger of his own that the long, cold years had left in him. Henry had begun to speak freely again, and to laugh. And on the night of the first snow, he sat on the window seat where once he had pretended to read and watched the flakes come down and said to Margaret without looking at her that her hair was long again. And Margaret, who had told him a lie about it once and had been forgiven for the lie before she ever asked, said yes, it was, and that it had been worth the selling, and that she would sell it again tomorrow if it bought what it had bought. She would not have to, though. That was the whole of it. In the end, she would not have to. On the mantel of that warm nursery, where Beatrice could reach it if she stood on the fender, sat a small object that no one but the family understood. It was a pair of scissors. Plain steel. The kind a wigmaker uses. The kind that had closed once against the back of a young woman's neck in a cold shop on Bishop Lane, while the 3rd snow of the season fell outside the window. Julian had gone himself to the shop in the spring and bought them back, and had said nothing about why, and had set them on the nursery mantel where they would catch the firelight on winter evenings, and Margaret had understood and had let them stay. They sat there still. On the last night this story will tell of catching the glow of a fire that no child in that house would ever again go cold beside, while outside the snow came down soft and steady over Greywick, and inside a man who had once decided never to feel again sat on a nursery floor with his 3 children and his wife, and learned. Slowly, evening by evening, the thing it had taken him so long and cost her so much to teach him, which was that a person's worth is not in what the world can see of it, but in what they will give in the dark when no one is watching and no one will ever know, and they do it anyway. If Margaret's winter moved you, stay a moment in it before you go, and think of the people in your own life who fed you when no one came. They had names too. Someone should learn them.